with people like Fukuzawa Yukichi and his harsh critique of Confucianism and of its negative influences, negative effects on Japanese society. And we have things like the Meirokuzashi and many other activities throughout the late 1860s and the 1870s, which were devoted to the total westernization of Japanese society. And we also had the gakusei, or the education system, school system, that regulations that were promulgated in the 1870s that removed Confucianism entirely from the Japanese school curriculum. So the Japanese were the first to step up and say, Confucianism is bad. It no longer works for us. The second were the Koreans. In 1884, a group of young Korean intellectuals, inspired very much by the Meiji Restoration and influenced in part by Fukuzawa Yukichi, attempted to carry out a coup d'etat in Seoul, which they hoped would allow them to achieve in Korea what the Meiji Restoration had achieved in Japan. Their coup d'etat failed rather miserably. And they were either arrested or they had to flee into exile. And so after the coup d'etat, then there were still some people thinking quietly that we need to go beyond Confucianism. We need to radically change our society. But they did not have a public voice. It wasn't until the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 and 1895 that things changed radically in Korea. Nobody imagined that the Japanese would be able to defeat China, but the Japanese defeated China very handily. Shortly after the war broke out in 1894, the Chinese were forced out of the Korean Peninsula. The Japanese were there in large numbers. And they brought back with them some of the men who had participated in the 1884 coup. And starting in 1894 and through 1895, they pushed through a series of reforms that we call the Kabo reforms, the 1894 reforms in Korea. These were reforms that rejected Confucianism and attempted to move Korea in the direction that Japan had gone in westernizing reforms. But this was followed by the tripartite intervention by Russia, France, and Germany against Japan. And anti-Japanese forces in Korea took courage from this, and they allied themselves with the Russians. And many of the reforms that were implemented were passed in 1894 and 1895 were either ignored or revoked. And so Korea began to move in a more conservative direction once again until 1905. What happened in 1905, of course, was the end of the Russo-Japanese War. The Treaty of Portsmouth in September 1895 basically provided that Russia would recognize Japanese interests in Korea. Shortly after the Treaty of Portsmouth, the Japanese forced a protectorate treaty on Korea, which meant that the Japanese were in charge of Korea's defense and Korea's foreign affairs. But in fact, the Japanese also began to interfere very heavily in Korea's domestic affairs. At this point, Korean thinkers said, oops, this is really dangerous. And we get the rise of what is known in Korea as the Egokemonundong, or the Patriotic Enlightenment Movement. Now, this Enlightenment movement had many different strands to it, but one of the most important features was a very thorough anti-Confucianism. One of the most prominent anti-Confucian thinkers of that time was a man named Shin Chae-ho. Shin Chae-ho said, the reason why we in Korea have become so weak, why we have suffered at the hands of these imperialists, why we now have Japan inside Korea, is because we've blindly followed Chinese civilization for the last 1,000 years. Shin went on to say that what we need to do is go back to the traditions of ancient Korea, when we were strong, when a country like Goguryeo was able to defeat Sui and Tang armies. If we go back to that tradition, then we can strengthen ourselves, we can cast off the bonds of the Japanese, and we can advance forward. So he was one anti-Confucian thinker. Another one was a Christian convert by the name of Yun Chi-ho. Yun sounded many of the same themes as Shin Che-ho in regard to the critique on Confucianism. He said, what has Confucianism brought to Korea? It's brought us poverty, it's brought us corruption, it's brought us weakness, it's brought us oppression of women. Confucianism is bad. We need to become Christians. So those two thinkers sounded very important anti-Confucian things between 1905 and 1910. What about China? Well, Japan started first, the 1860s and 1870s. Korea came along in the 1890s and the 1900s. A thoroughgoing critique of Confucianism in China really didn't get started until the 1910s. In the mid-1910s, you begin to get these people who were often referred to as iconoclasts, people who begin to argue that there are significant differences between China and the West and that China needs to learn from the West. And then on May 4th, 1919, we had the breakout of the May 4th movement, which began as a protest to Japanese aggression, but it soon developed into a very thoroughgoing anti-Confucian movement, which blamed the ills of modern China on Confucianism. So finally, China, by 1919, was engaged in this thing. But during the same period, this time of imperialism, there were countercurrents. There were people who were saying, hold it, wait a minute. We see it in Japan. After the craze for westernizing reforms in Japan in the 1860s and the 1870s, by the early 1880s, a reaction set in. And many Japanese are saying, wait a minute. We try to turn ourselves into Englishmen or Americans or Frenchmen, then who are we? We lose our identity. And so they begin to say, wait, we need to go back to our own traditions as well. And this began to include a revival of some Confucian values. And this was perhaps best revealed in the 1890 Rescript on Education that was promulgated by the Japanese emperor, which called for, among other things, imperial subjects to be trained in loyalty and filial piety. What about in Korea? Well, in Korea, as these young radicals of 1884 and again 1894 and 1895 were attempting to westernize Korea, there were these reactionary Confucians out in the countryside who, under the slogan of reject the false, which was Western learning, and protect the true, which was Confucianism, were adamantly opposed to any sort of reform, any sort of opening of Korea to the West. And they even formed small guerrilla army units to fight against both Japanese and